happen. We have with us Jonathan Hollerman. Jonathan, welcome to the Hagmann Report.
Hey, thanks for having me on, John.
Well, Jonathan, we are so thrilled and pleased that you could be with us this evening. Now, for our listeners and viewers, you may be familiar with the name Jonathan Hollerman because he recently just received an enormous blessing and landed front and center on the Drudge Report last weekend. And I was excited to see you there, Jonathan, because I have read all three of the preparedness fiction, prepper fiction, if you will, books in your EMP series. EMP, of course, means electromagnetic pulse, but in the case of Jonathan's work, it means equipping modern patriots. Now, our guest, Jonathan Hollerman, he's got a great, interesting background. First of all, he owns Grid Down Consulting here in Pennsylvania, and really not far from the Hagmann Report studios. So we're going to talk a little bit about what he does to help families all over the country get squared away. But he got his start with the U.S. Air Force as a seer, and we're going to talk about that as well. And we titled tonight's show Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape, because that's what the SEER acronym means. So with that being said, hot off the presses of dailymail.co.uk, our debut guest, Jonathan Hollerman. Jump on in, Jonathan. Let's get started.
All right. Hey, I'm happy to be on the show here tonight, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you fine gentlemen.
Fantastic. Well, let's do this. Do you want to talk let's give people a little idea of who you are. Let's unpack and extrapolate a little bit the SEER training first. I thought that was super fascinating when we spoke offline. Jonathan, this is training done by the Air Force, and it makes grown men cry like babies within the course of 5 to 6 days.
Yeah, so my job as a field instructor, as a SEER instructor, it stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape, like you mentioned, was to take pilots, navigators, essentially anybody that flies on a plane for their job. It was to take them out in the field and train them how to survive if they got shot down or behind enemy lines. And so, I mean, you're teaching them the basic wilderness survival stuff, like how to build a shelter, how to build a fire, navigation, point-to-point navigation using a compass, triangulation, things of that nature. And essentially, throughout the course of the training, we would transition it more into an evasion setting, whereas if they're behind enemy lines, role-playing, and we would take all that information and transition it into an evasion setting and teaching them how to stay alive while staying hidden.
Excellent. And all these things are so important. You know, we always talk about the where to begin. Water, food, and shelter. You know, you need water. You can survive with up to 3 days, food 3 weeks, and shelter is a necessity. The need for the way we live as a society today, it is how can you say this? It's a perfect recipe for disaster if a
Absolutely.
proper calamity were to happen. How do you think that you write in detail in your books how this is going to play out? Do you believe the statistics that after an EMP 1 year, 90% of the population would not survive?
Anytime you're dealing with statistics, there's always room for error, right?
Right. Right.
I do believe a large percentage of the Americans would die. We walk a knife's edge today. Every aspect of human life revolves around electricity. We just take it for granted.
Mm-hmm.
Even our grandparents at this point have grown up with electricity. The life skills and the tools needed to survive without electricity, that information, that's long gone. Those skill sets do not abide in the American populace today. So every aspect of human life revolves around technology. I mentioned in my book how when you go to the grocery store and you swipe a can of beans across the register there's a computer in that register that sends an email down to the grocery store distribution center, and it says, hey, put another can of beans on the next truck. The distribution center sends an email to the canning facility, put another can of beans on the next truck. The canning facility sends an email to the farm in Mexico or wherever that grows the beans and says, put another truckload of beans on the next, send them up here. So all of that information travels electronically. The grocery stores don't have stock markets, big stock rooms in the back of the store anymore. They just don't. If you've ever gone to the grocery store and they were out of something, you ask them if they look in the back, they kind of look at you funny, And it's on-demand food infrastructure that we live off of today. And if that's interrupted because of we have a long-term loss of the electric grid, then there's going to be a massive loss of life, because at the end of the day, we have 350 million Americans living on this landmass that we call America. And there's no way to feed that many people, because just nobody really grows their own food anymore. About 100 years ago, 98% of the people grew at least some portion of their food intake. Today, it's less than 2% of the populace grow food for the other 98%. So without interstate trucking, and even if there's a lot of questions on whether cars or trucking will function. Well, if the gas pumps aren't working, the street lights aren't working, the trucks aren't going to be rolling anyway. So the idea that you can feed 350 million Americans for an extended period of time without electricity, it just can't. It can't happen. It's just not going to happen. And I think one of the things that a lot of people will say to me is, they see these Hollywood movies where they've got flat-ton military trucks rolling down the road, passing out MREs. That's not going to happen either. FEMA has 6 million MREs as backup at any given point in time, typically for a natural disaster. And that's not going to feed 350 million people for one day, right? So, and the big thing that I always mention, so they have this idea that at some point the government's going to step in and help, okay? I've got a DOD report that was given to Congress, that was made to Congress, trying to get mini nuclear reactors that are kind of like small batteries. They're not actually a nuclear reactor. It's a nuclear battery to power today's military bases, because the American people don't realize that 99% of United States military bases are wholly reliant on the civilian electric grid. In that report to Congress, they straight up say if there's a long-term loss of the electric grid, we will not be able to respond to societal collapse or social chaos. So the military is not coming in to save you.
Jonathan, I'm sorry, Joe, did you have something?
No, go for it.
One of the things so again, I read all three of your books in the Equipping Modern Patriot series. And for a lot of our listeners and viewers, they may want to exercise the option, as I did with a couple of them, and you can get those on audiobook as well. I use the Audible app. We don't have Audible's not a sponsor. They were at one time, but Audible, it's $10-15 a month, and you can get books like Jonathan Hollerman's, and you can listen to them, while you're commuting or doing your housework or whatever. And that's how I first got into the series. Now let's talk about that for a minute, because our listeners and viewers know that I've read a lot of prepper fiction, or what sometimes we call faction, a fictional plot paradigm that is built around the facts of how our society operates. And in your books, you have probably the most realistic approach to what I have always perceived society would devolve to, I would say, than any other preparedness fiction I've read. And they really kind of stand in a category of their own as well, because I found good, tight themes, but I didn't find a lot of irrelevant sort of utopian ideology that would suggest that neighbors are going to kumbaya and help each other out, etc. And one of the points that you make, and it seems like a lot of your plot devices and a lot of the struggle your characters go through kind of operate in between these two polarities. And those polarities are when humans begin to deal with starvation and desperation. With that, I'll clam up, Jonathan, and hand it back to you.
Right. So that was one of my big takeaways from my SEER training, was having that interaction with highly trained pilots and navigators and flight medics, highly trained soldiers, and watching how fast their psychological ability to make simple decisions on a daily basis, how fast that deteriorated when you take away most of their food, when you take away a lot of their sleep, when you put them in a stressful situation. So I watched as I carried students, and by day 3 or day 4, I mean, this scenario was just tearing them apart. And I mentioned to John earlier that, there probably wasn't a single class I carried where I didn't have a full-grown man at some point break down crying just due to the stress and the lack of food and the lack of sleep. So taking that away from my SEER training, that didn't really stand with me at the time. So after I got a SEER, I went to college and did a bunch of other things. I owned a small business, and I kind of stayed clear of politics for quite a while. I wasn't really interested. And before I read the book 1 Second After, and then I read James Wesley Rawls' Patriots. This was a long time ago when they first came out. And that kind of woke me up to the EMP scenario. So I really dug in. I did as much research as I could do. I read the EMP Commission report. I'm a researcher. I'm an entrepreneur, self-taught type of guy. And I just kind of tried to find any information I could find, because when I read those books, I was like, holy cow, this is crazy. Why isn't the media talking about this? Why isn't the American people aware of this, existential threat to our country? So after digging in, I started reading other prepper fiction in the genre, in the EMP genre. And I don't want to name anybody by names. And it was one of those things where I just had a hard time reading those stories, because I didn't feel like the authors that were writing the stories had any firsthand experience in a third world country feeding starving people. They didn't have any experience with desperate people, starvation, things of this nature. And the scenarios that they were painting, I just didn't feel were very realistic. So that's what caused me to pen the first book, EMP, Equipping Modern Patriots, A Story of Survival. And I wrote that. And the funny part is I wrote that thinking I'd sell like maybe 200 copies to my ex-military buddies. And after about 3 weeks after it released, I was checking it each day, seeing how it was doing. And then I went to hunting camp, and I was gone for, I don't know, maybe like a week and a half. And when I came back, it was selling like 200 copies a day, and it just kept going up, and it hit the top 10 bestsellers list. And so that really opened my eyes to, hey, my philosophy and what I believe and how people will react is really resonating with people. And I think part of that is because I did a lot in that research. I researched human psychology behind desperation and starvation. And Philip Zimbardo, he's a world-renowned psychologist. He did this 1970 Stanford prison experiment. If anybody gets a chance, I'd recommend his book, The Lucifer Effect. It'll really wake you up to his whole life's work revolves around how good people can do evil things. He studied how the Germans went along with the Holocaust in Germany. He studied how an average everyday Oklahoma farm boy could go to Vietnam and commit horrible atrocities. And what he found out is when there's no oversight, in other words, there's no law and order, and you put people in stressful and desperate situations, they're capable of anything. And most Americans in this, and a lot of the other people in my industry, have this idea that somehow America's different. We're different here for some reason. And like when something like this happens, everyone's going to just stand around, hold hands, and sing Kumbaya, right? And it's not going to happen. They'll use instances like Hurricane Katrina. Well, look, we rallied around, we came down, and we helped all the desperate people down in New Orleans. Well, that's because there's some guy with Cheeto dust in his beard sitting on a couch somewhere watching it on the news. He's like, I got to get down there and help, right? He has a full belly. In an EMP or a long-term grid down scenario, there's no rescue coming. There's no FEMA. There's nobody coming to bail you out. So I really think this idea that everyone's going to work together, it's not going to happen, because you can take your average blue-collar Joe, he goes to church every Sunday. He's the nicest guy in the world. But when hasn't been able to feed his daughter for 3-4 weeks, and he's watching this 4-year-old little girl starve to death on his couch, and she's on her last leg, basically, that man is a natural-born killer. He may beg and plead at first, but he will do anything to get his kids some food. Same with women. Mothers will do anything to get their kids some food. And so this idea that you can work together if people are, in such dire straits where they're starving to death, it's not going to happen. So that was kind of the premise behind my book. Was painting a little bit maybe of a bleaker picture of a post-collapse scenario.
Jonathan, we've been seeing in the news these stories of the rich buying up all these doomsday bunkers and whatnot. I want to ask you this. Obviously, you are an expert in the field of preparedness. If people don't have a lot of people don't have the resources to just go up and buy a bunker, what are some simple, common sense ways to get started aside from just buying, some extra food at the grocery store each week to put away, what are some of the simple tips that people could apply immediately, we'll say, in the face of a disaster or a situation where they might be in a survival situation?
Sure. So preparedness, more than anything else, is a mindset. Okay. And the key to that is education. So you have to understand the threat. If you don't educate yourself and understand the threat, then your chances of survival plummet, regardless of how many supplies and everything that you have. So the first thing I would say is to dig in the EMP Commission report, read their report, read some of this. Dr. Vincent Peter Pry has written a lot of great articles. You can research him and dig into this threat a little bit. So the first thing is understanding what human nature is, and it's not going to be all gumdrops and lollipops when something like this happens. And develop a plan of action. So one of the key things that I hear a lot is, I don't have the financial resources for a multi-million-dollar survival retreat bunker somewhere in the mountains. And I get that. A lot of my clients are in the same setting. But if you resort to riding it out at home in the middle of an inner city where you have possibly millions of starving people, or even thousands or tens of thousands of soon to be starving people surrounding you, it's going to get a lot worse than you think it will. And then I hear a lot, well, I'm going to ride out here till it gets so bad, and then I'm going to go to my Uncle Charlie's farm. Well, at that point, if it gets to the point where it's so bad at home, you don't need to be out on the open road traveling with your family. That's going to be a very dangerous situation. So one of my biggest recommendations is develop a plan of action to, especially if you live in a town setting or a city, to get out of town immediately in the case of a grid down scenario. Now, we're not talking about a financial collapse or pandemic that happens slower over time, but in the case of a grid down scenario, you need to realize that you have to get away from people immediately. Go to Uncle Bob's farm, whatever the case may be. If you're surrounded by tens of thousands, millions of starving people, it's not gonna end well for you.
Yeah, you can say that again. It absolutely, when you think about preparedness, many people think of just their immediate, family or the people that they live with and interact with on a daily basis. But you have, this whole community, and this really needs to be a community effort. How are ways people seem so reluctant to get involved, to change, to even engage in a preparedness type mindset. What are some of the tips you have to get neighbors, communities involved and more actionable on the preparedness side?
Sure. So I would focus more on family members and relatives than I would community, or I've heard this idea of getting together with your neighbors on a cul-de-sac, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And joining forces and forming a security perimeter, which depends on the size of the group. It's probably not going to work. And from there, the biggest problem I have with that is you could talk with your neighbors all you want, and they may just say stuff to, kind of say, hey, I'm on board. But at the end of the day, you don't know if they put their money where their mouth is. At the end of the day, if you have 15 people on the end of your block that you're working with, and you're the only one that's put away a year's worth of long-term food, guess whose food they're eating? Yours. And you're never going to make it through the first winter. You're never going to make it to harvest time if you are working with a group of people that didn't prepare beforehand. That's a reason preparedness, you need to focus on yourself, your immediate family first, get a plan of action for that, then start incorporating family members. But mutual assurance group is what it's called in the industry, and try to put together a mutual assurance group with semi-friendly neighbors that may or may not be completely on board or as on board as they're letting out. That there's a lot of big risks involved with that. So in my book, Survival Theory, so I guess one thing I would throw out is I wrote a book called Survival Theory. It's a preparedness guide, how to survive the end of the world on a budget. And I wrote that for people that can't afford a multi-million-dollar retreat. Okay, it lays out plans of action for you as an individual and as a family, where to take your family, how to survive, what to do if you don't have the money for a full off-grid survival retreat. Because be honest with you, that's 95% of my clients. 95% of my clients are individuals, businessmen, doctors, lawyers, professional athletes, people that have the money to build a fully stocked off-grid survival retreat. So that's most of my time is dealing clients with that. I fly all over the country. I was in 6 different states in the last 4 weeks doing reviews of existing survival retreats. And I'll do an analysis. I'll go through all their off-grid infrastructure, their operational security, their long-term food, basically every aspect of their survival retreat, make recommendations. So that's a lot of my business. But for people that don't, I guess I'll say something that a lot of people aren't going to want to hear, but if you don't have a lot of money, it's going to make it a lot more difficult to feed your family. Okay. If you don't prepare beforehand, it's going to make it difficult. It's not impossible, but you better have a plan of action in place to get away from mass population centers when the time comes.
Yeah.
Wow. You know, Jonathan, I've got I've got questions pouring out of both ears that I want to ask you, but for expediency's sake, because there's nothing I'd like more than to bring you back on occasion so we can really go through some of these, because, you know, under the preparedness minded topic, there are so many subtopics that themselves you can write entire books on. I was wondering, Jonathan, I know we got to speak a little bit today. We do share a mutual faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. Would you like to comment for a moment or two? We've got about a good 5 minutes left. What's your take on the state of the American Christian church today when you combine it with the idea of living a preparedness-minded lifestyle? Where is the remnant body of Christ, Jonathan?
Wow, you really put my feet to the fire here. So as a Christian individual, as a Christian man, the last chapter of my book, Survival Theory, is called A Biblical Perspective on Preparedness. Now, there are essentially 2 camps that I find in the Christian church today. There is the camp of, I'm not going to worry about tomorrow. I'm going to solely focus on today, which is biblical, and I'm not going to make any plans for tomorrow, and I'm going to trust 100% and rely 100% on God's miraculous provision when the time comes, okay? And I will never fault, I will never demonize anybody that takes that stance, right? I fall on the other side where I believe that, you know, you look at the story of Joseph in Egypt and preparing for the famine that was coming. If you are aware of a crisis that is coming, okay? And I don't know if it's going to be next week, 2 years from now, or 20 years from now, or never. Okay, I'm not a prophet. I'm not going to sit here and say that this is coming tomorrow. Okay, try and scare people, because the last thing you can do is operate your preparedness in a mindset of fear. I get that question all the time. How do you live with all this? I don't worry. I don't worry. You know, I've got my Lord Savior Jesus Christ, and I'm going to deal with it when it comes. Right? I'm not, and you'll never be fully prepared. Doesn't matter how much money you have, how much effort you spend into preparedness. You're never going to be fully there. There's always going to be things that you want to improve and get better at. But to ignore the potential that there's a long-term collapse coming or something where it could impact your ability to feed your children, right? I believe there's nothing crazy about putting some food away for your family and developing a plan of action for a worst-case scenario. So a lot of the same people that would take that stance of, you know, I'm not going to worry about tomorrow, I almost guarantee you they've got home insurance, they've got car insurance, they've got life insurance, they've got insurance on their electronics, they've got dental insurance, they've got all these insurances. And what those are is, in the case of a rainy day, you're covered, right? So preparedness should be just another facet of that. I call it survival insurance. That's all you're doing is you're putting together a survival insurance policy for you and your family. And treat it like your life insurance policy. There's no reason to discuss it with anybody else. Nobody needs to know how much your life is worth on your life insurance policy. Nobody needs to know that you've got food in your basement for your family, because at the end of the day, those types of people are going to be showing up to eat your food, right? So that's basically how I treat it with my clients. My philosophy is prepare for the worst and hope for the best, and then let God do the rest.
Jonathan Hollerman, thank you so much for joining us. The interview went too quick. We're going to have you back on. Folks, you can follow Jonathan at Grid Down Prepper on Twitter and check out the EMP series. Also, the website, griddownconsulting.com. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. We'll do it again.